So I want to point out that we do hoe. And so you'll see, if you see a picture of people hoeing, hopefully you won't see me in it. I'll find, oh, I've got to go cut some hay or something. I'll find something else to do on a tractor if I can. But yeah, so everything from like here to here, I can do with the tractor. But right in that, this looks like beets maybe. You know, if you got to get in there with the hose and get those weeds out and break the crust, aerate it, and check evaporation. So we use a wide variety of hose. So there's the hose that I like are pointy. There's like they look like a triangle, and they're handy in that when you have a triangular hoe, something like that, you can go like this and use it as a flat hoe, or you can use it as a point. So it's real handy. Another thing you can do is, if your plant's right here, you can actually take your weeds and push them out. You don't always have to be hoeing forward. You can actually take that and push it too on the far side of the row that you're hoeing. We use the hose that come down and have a now how did I get a black line? Anyway, that have you ever seen those kind? They're forks. And if your soil gets real hard, those are nice because you can get them in the ground real good. And they're kind of like it's like a claw. Yeah. And then we use the Rogue hose, which are they're actually made out of a disc. And so they're curved this way and this way. And they're good for moving soil around. And then we use just the regular flat hose, and that's good for like hilling up the potatoes or, you know, moving stuff, moving a lot of soil around. And there's a stirrup hose, which would be kind of like that. And this is hollow, and there's just a thing here, and it kind of wiggles right here. It's kind of hinged, you know, the stirrup hose. So these are handy in certain soils. I've never found them to be handy. My dad loved those up in the sandy soil, but in the clay soils, I haven't found them to be handy. And our soils are very, very rocky. And so I've never sharpened hose because there's no sense because there's so many rocks where I live. The last hoe I got is kind of shaped like that, and the handle on it is 7 feet long. And that one, you hold it up like this, and you go like this. So you're all the time standing straight up, and you kind of stir like that, rather than bending over and hoeing like that. So while we're hoeing, your back is going to be bent a lot. So we stop, we go like that and stretch, you know, backwards. Try to, if you're hoeing like this for a while, then you might switch sides and hoe the other way. So you're, using different parts of your body. But we routinely spend 5 or 6 hours a day hoeing. So despite the nice tractors and everything, we still have to get out there and do this. Yeah. So any questions about hoes or comments? Favorite hoes y'all have?
Would you mulch more to do less hoeing?
Yes. Yeah. So if the fields weren't so big, yeah, we would. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because mulching does a lot of the things that the three main things that tillage does. The three things that tillage does is it retains moisture, it aerates, keeps the air loose, the soil loose and full of air, and it gets rid of weeds. So when you put a mulch down, that's going to help preserve moisture. It keeps the sun and the beating rains from hitting the soil, so that keeps the soil aerated, and the mulch prevents the weeds from sprouting. So the problem is, in a crop, say like beets, that's a 60-day crop. I plant it. I really couldn't mulch it until after 35, 40 days because it's got to get up there. And then in another 3 weeks, the crop's out of the field. So it's not worth it. Whereas tomatoes, I plant them, I mulch them after they get a little bigger and the soil has thoroughly warmed up. Don't mulch right away because the soil is it keeps the soil cool. And for a tomato, you want it to be real hot. But any of the crops that are going to be in the ground for a long time, it does make sense to mulch. Not even the potatoes, you can put potatoes down and throw hay over them and they'll come up right through the hay. So the spring and summer crops that we grow would be celery, lettuce, summer squash, green beans, onions. All of these things, potatoes, corn, all these things like soil that has a pretty good balance of fungal activity and bacterial activity. So when I cultivate, I'm selecting for bacteria and I'm hurting the fungal activity. The reason being that the fungal activity is long strands of fungal hyphae reaching through the soil, whereas bacteria is more like little dots. Can you all picture that? Yeah. So if I'm hoeing or cultivating, I'm chopping up the fungal strands, but it doesn't hurt the bacteria as much. So by fall, my fields are lesser fungally dominated and have more bacteria domination in the soil food web. Well, it so happens that the family of plants called brassicas like a bacterial dominated soil. So they grow really good in the fall because of our soils have had cultivated crops before them. So we don't grow any brassica crops on our farm in the spring. I might grow some spring radishes or something, but nothing that lasts. So we do this for a wide variety of reasons, not just for the microbial dominations, but also it just gets too darn hot in the spring, so the brassicas don't do very well. And so we found that they do a lot better in the fall. And also we can break the life cycle of the harlequin bugs and the cabbage loopers and some of the things that come in the spring. They're floating around, the little cabbage butterflies are floating around my farm, and they look at me and they go, "Where's the brassicas?" And I go, "Ha ha 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 ha. There's nothing here for you to eat." And so they can't make babies and be a problem in the fall. Yeah, so. And the harlequin bug too is a little orange and black bug. It can be a real problem in brassicas. And I had a real interesting incident happen one time. I had left some kale to go to seed. We save seed on kale and every few years. And so this field then had a lot of kale seed in it. And then when I plowed it later, a whole bunch of kale came up during the summer. And I didn't think that that was the problem. But what happened is it got a bunch of these harlequin bugs in it. And then when I planted my fall cabbages, you could see right where the kale had been, and the harlequin bugs were just marching down the rows, eating my cabbages, and going right from where the kale had been, going down. They got about halfway down the hill down to the field before my cabbages got big enough to withstand them. So yeah, there's timing seems to be like everything in this farming thing. Yeah. So situations that don't require tillage. And so I think where's Patrick when I need him? So he would love to talk right now, because this is the kind of thing that they like to do here, I think, is they try to have a permanent mulch down. So we don't need tillage when we're raising cows. The cows have little plows on their feet. So the split hoof of a cow, when the cow puts its weight on that hoof, it splits. Have you ever watched that? It's really interesting, and it just looks like a little plow in the ground. It tills it just enough to help the grass and clover to grow well. And then another place we don't use tillage is if we're mulching. Yeah, so we plant the garlic and then we just mulch it. This is a crop that's in the ground for 9 or 10 months or so. That makes sense to mulch in that situation. Any kind of a permaculture garden, just keep adding mulches. If you're growing perennials like berries and things like that, I do take issue with the use of wood chips before they're rotted. I feel like there's evidence in most places I go of nitrogen being depleted in the soils by using wood chip mulch that's not fully decomposed. And so carbon is it's just in love with nitrogen, and nitrogen loves carbon, and they're going to find each other and hook up no matter what's going on. You can't keep them apart. And so what happens then is the nitrogen in the soil, it's not really permanently robbed, it's just temporarily robbed, because instead of growing the crop, it's going to go over and help rot the wood chips. Yeah, and so your crops will then be a little peaked. They'll be a lighter green color and almost to the point of yellowness. And you can see that in places where they use wood chips. Wood chips are poisonous. They have tannic acid, and they need to sit for several years. I like to let them sit for 5 to 10 years before I use them in composting or gardening. And hay, too, has a lot of carbon, but if it started to rot, it's okay, and it doesn't have a huge amount of contact because it's fluffed up. Straw has a lot more carbon and will rob nitrogen a lot more than hay will. I grew a field of potatoes one time, and half of it we mulched with hay, and half we mulched with straw, and boy, you could just tell the difference. It was like a line right down the field. The hay potatoes were dark green, and the straw ones were yellow. Yeah, so that really showed me that. So do y'all know the difference between hay and straw? Hay is the dried grass and clovers, and straw is the stalks of grains like wheat or rye. Yeah, so there is a difference between straw and hay. Yeah, many people don't know that. Yeah, so intensely grazing the cattle. Cows kind of have a bad name because of the way that they raise them now. So it's a really bad idea to grow corn and soybeans and use these artificial fertilizers and poisons, and then take the cows and put them in feedlots and feed them that stuff. So that's really what's wrong with the planet today, is cows being raised wrong. But mind you, cows are the way we're going to solve climate change too, because the cattle have the ability to help the land sequester carbon. So carbon right now is in the atmosphere. There's too much in the atmosphere, but there's not enough carbon in the soil. The soils used to have 8% carbon or 10%. Now they have 1 or 2%. And we have to get this carbon from the atmosphere. I think there's 400 gigatons in the atmosphere. And the oceans are full of carbon. We can't put it there. The soil is the only place that we can put this carbon. So we feel like that we could do this with 3 states. I need Indiana, Illinois, and Iowa. And then we need to mob graze them. And this involves having thousands of head of cattle on an acre for 20 minutes. And then they leave. And you don't let them on that acre again for another 6 months. And this is what the Indians were doing with the buffalo. And they were moving, these buffaloes would range from Mexico all the way up to Canada for summer, and then all the way back down to Mexico for the winter. And they did this every season, and they would go to these places, and they would only graze them once or twice a year, if that often. The grasses would get 6 and 8 feet tall. And then these massive herds, they would say there would be miles and miles of nothing but animals. And the land would look devastated afterwards. But it was full of tilled in manure and pee. And the secretions from animals, all the spit and snot and all that kind of stuff was extremely valuable for soil life. And so this land then this was, when a cow eats the grass, they would rather just have the tippy top of that. That's where the hydrogen is. That's the mother load. The rest of its carbon, which they just tromp into the ground. So this kind of sounds like it doesn't make sense. Why would you want to not let the cows eat the whole plant? No, you want them just to eat a little bit of the plant and tromp the rest of it into the ground, because that's carbon from the atmosphere that the plant has taken out through photosynthesis, and it puts that carbon back into the soil. And we think we can do this at about the rate of 15 gigatons per year, and within maybe 20 years get the ratios down to where they was in pre-industrial levels, which was about 256 gigatons in the atmosphere. And mind you, 200 years ago, not only was there this less carbon in the atmosphere, more carbon in the soil, the Earth was supporting 3 times as many ruminants. So these big, large animals, elephants and cattle and bison stuff, were making really good soils. And this is hard for people to believe, how important it is to have the big, giant mammals. And so what they were doing is they were keeping the soils full of carbon, and which makes growing crops easier. It's like organic gardening. You want carbon in your garden. Yeah, so, we have got to quit using the synthetic nitrogen. This is a big, big problem. It's 300 times more polluting in this layer up in the soil than the carbon. Do you all know about nitrogen? You know where it comes from? It comes from the weapons industry. So there was a great war in 1914, and the war was predicted to end in a few months, and the war did end in a few months. And it was ended because the English army blockaded all the known sources of nitrate, particularly a naval battle that happened off the coast of Chile in the Falkland Islands over a pile of bird shit. And this was the Chilean nitrate that they were shipping around and making gunpowder out of. So gunpowder is nitrate, oftentimes potassium nitrate, saltpeter, mixed with phosphorus. There's your NPK. And so this war ended, but then Germany scientists figured out how to synthesize atmospheric nitrogen in a factory using a huge amount of pressure and a huge amount of heat. Then this takes a lot of petroleum products and a lot of energy. And so they're able to make ammonium nitrate. And so immediately Germany filled up with weapons plants that were making this nitrogen, and they sold the gunpowder to the German army to keep the war going. And quickly they realized, they sold it to the English army as well. And so they kept the war going for 6 years, and it was one of the worst carnages that ever happened on the planet. And a new power structure emerged that had nothing to do with England and Germany or any kind of countries. It had to do with who controls nitrogen. Because when you control nitrogen, you control gunpowder and you control food production. And these are very important. So every farming book that I have that's written before 1914 talks about how every farm has to have animals. Every farm has to make compost. Every farm has to grow cover crops. Every farm has to have legumes. Every farm has to practice crop rotation. Every book I have stresses that. Every farming book that I have past 1920 says never have animals and crops on the same land. You have crops with chemicals and you have animals in confinement. The only reason to do that is to concentrate wealth into the hands of a few people. And we can't be independent farmers if we play that game. We have to get our farms back where they're sequestering carbon and we're growing our own feeds and fertilizers on our farms. Yeah, so that's a little bit of political lesson there. So this animal impact then is great. We have to have these grasses and clovers. What's happening then is your grasses are finally dividing that clay soil, making little particles as those roots go in there. You know, the rye plant, you can take the roots off a rye plant and put them together, and it'll like 6 miles or something off of one plant. Unbelievable. And then the clovers are diving deeper into the soil, breaking up the subsoil and bringing air down in there. And so they grow symbiotically together. A field of grass or a field of clover won't do as well as if you put them both together in a field.